You might have seen things all over the internet in the last few years saying things like, you have fewer holidays than a medieval peasant, or a medieval peasant worked fewer hours than you. And we're going to take a little time here and we're just going to unpick some of that and have a look at what life was actually like for medieval peasants. And if you've been watching my channel for a little while now, you'll probably know that the answer is nuanced. Hi, I'm Jimmy, and medieval peasantry is a complex subject. It depends who you are and where you are and when you are if you want to answer the question, what was medieval life like for a peasant? And it changes depending on which country you're in, which king of that country is in charge, what century you're in, or even what town or village you're living in. There are lots of layers to medieval society, and we've all seen the feudal system pyramid, and this is a really, really, really simplistic way of looking at society in the medieval period. So the first thing we need to do to answer the question, what was life like for a medieval peasant, is find out what kind of peasant we're talking about. So peasantry in the medieval period is basically if you're royalty, or if you're minor nobility or major nobility, or if you're a member of the church technically, you're not a peasant. Everybody else is a peasant. You are a commoner. And if you're a commoner, life can be pretty great. But if you're a commoner, life can be pretty rubbish, and it all depends on where you are, who you are, and what you do, and who is in charge. So, for example, in Wales, if you live in the early medieval period in Wales, chances are, if you're a peasant, you are involved in agriculture. You're a farmer. You are tilling the soil, you're ploughing, you're a husbandman. You work the soil to grow produce of some sort, or livestock. And that is hard work. It's hard work now, it was hard work 1200 years ago. But in early medieval Wales, in sort of the 6th to the 11th or 12th centuries in some places, one thing that you probably don't do is work for money. Like, money is not a huge thing to you. We have money from medieval Wales, but as far as we can tell, for a good few hundred years, money wasn't really used that much. Coinage was abandoned after the Romans left, because people didn't need little pieces of silver with an emperor's head on them. They needed food. And the warlords and warrior chieftains didn't need coin. They needed men who could fight for them, and they needed food to feed themselves and their families. So kinship and food produce became much more important than financial gain in medieval Wales. And if you are a peasant in medieval Wales, you might be rhydd, you might be free, you might be an aillt, you might be unfree. And that depends on which minor or mainol you are living in. And if the word minor sounds very familiar, it's because it's very similar to the word manor, which was used in France and in England, and they mean similar things. But the word minor is actually much older than the word manor, and it comes from the Welsh word mine, meaning a stone. Now, free and unfree peasantry is kind of the crux of this video, because if you are a free peasant, you have a lot more, well, freedom, go figure, than if you are an unfree peasant. And that is not a slave. There is a difference here, and we're going to talk about that. Now, in Wales, the free peasantry were often people involved with things like animal husbandry. They were involved in livestock and the various crafts and trades. They were members of a household, of a noble or a king or a prince. The unfree peasantry tended to be the aillt peasantry tended to be people who worked on the land. So farmers, ploughmen, that kind of thing. Aillt means somebody who is shorn, so a shaved person, possibly because they had to shave their hair and their beards for practical reasons, but that is a debatable topic. The point is, an unfree peasant works their lord's land. That lord, that landlord, is somebody that you have to work for. You are in a contract with that person above you on the social ladder in the pyramid, and you have to work their land. You work their land in exchange for land and shelter. You get a house, You get a hut, a hovel to live in. You have some land that you then get to work. But you also have to work your lord's land, and the produce from that goes straight to him. You get to have food as well. You get land. This is something that is often missing from these explanations. You farm your lord's land. Say you've got a strip field, and then that is his land, or you've got 3 strip fields that are your lord's land. You have to farm that. You also have a little strip of land that you farm to grow food for yourself. That is generally how it worked in most areas and at most times. You have to subsist, right? You are a subsistence farmer. You need that food. In Wales, a lot of the produce that goes up the ladder to the noblemen and to the kings then gets redistributed. So it will come to the king or the prince or the uchelwr in charge of your particular cantref, your particular sort of zone. And I've got a video explaining Welsh land terminology if you want to learn a little bit more about that whole complex hornet's nest. Then when the king progresses around the kingdom, he will redistribute the food that has been produced according to the needs of the local area. That was the system in Wales, and that's a system that's been in place, we think, since the end of the Stone Age. In the Bronze Age palaces of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans and possibly China, we think that this centralised court that you see at places like Knossos was where all of the produce went and then got redistributed out to the people. So it's not a pseudo-anarchic syndicalist commune, but you know, there's a system in place here that kind of looks after everybody in a way. If you're a free peasant, you are, say, looking after a herd of cattle or sheep or pigs or whatever it may be. You farm and then you give your lord tax money, a certain amount of produce, but you are not forced to work on that land. You can move somewhere else if you want to. An unfree peasant, in England and in France they're called often villeins or serfs. You are in serfdom. You have to work that land. Those 3 strips, you have to work those. You do not get to move anywhere else. That is your life. Okay, you are a serf. You are a villein. A villein, in English and in French, from villein and ultimately from villanus, somebody who works on a villa, a Roman noble's house, works there. You work there. That is your land. Your contract says that you work there. If your landlord says so, he can move you to different land. And it may be, at least in England and France, that if you move from this patch of land to this patch of land, you are no longer a villein. Okay? So it's not necessarily who you are, it's where you are. That's an interesting part of it as well, where you often see serfdom, but you can become free simply by being shunted onto a different patch of farmland. And then all of a sudden you go from being somebody who doesn't get to move off their land, who has to pay fees to not get corporal punishment, has to pay a fine if they allow their daughter to marry outside of the manor, outside of their area. You have to pay a fine for that. You might have to pay a fine for bearing children outside of wedlock, and the church would frown on that anyway, so that's never a good idea in medieval Europe. Just trust. You might have to pay fines for all sorts of little things. You don't get to leave the manor. Your children and your family don't get to leave without the express permission of your lord. You have to pay if you want to be manumitted, potentially, if you want to leave that land, you might have to pay your lord. You might have to say, hey, listen, villeinage isn't working out for me anymore. I don't want this. I have enough money. Please, can I leave? And your lord might say no. To being someone who can say, listen, I'm moving on. And legally you can't stop me from moving on, so I'm leaving this manor, I'm leaving this village, and I'm going to go and move to the city. I'm going to go and move somewhere else. I'm going to go on pilgrimage. If you're a villein and you want to go on pilgrimage, you may have to ask your lord. And if they refuse, they have to explain to the local church why they're refusing, and never a good idea to go on the wrong side of the church in medieval Europe, you know what I'm saying? But they could theoretically and legally refuse to allow you to leave. And one of the interesting things is, if you are a villein, and your daughter marries somebody outside the village and moves over there, You are paying your lord for the loss of potential future villeins in your area, right? Loss of labour force. It's extraordinary. Now, people did move. Obviously, people were moving around, populations changed, cities grow, all that sort of thing. There are reasons why a lord might want somebody to leave his land. He might have too many villeins in the local area, and you might say, "Hey, have you considered letting your son leave and go to the city? Maybe he wants to become an apprentice silversmith. Why don't you send him over to Bruges to live there instead of occupying land here and being another mouth to feed?" But you are also potentially required to fight wars for your lord. So there's a balance here. Not every manor, not every area had villeins. Some were completely composed of free subjects, of free peasants. Some manors didn't have any free peasants and were completely composed of villeins. It's very nuanced depending on where and when we are. And in Wales, this is further complicated by the alltid problem. An alltid is a foreign-born, it's a foreign person, somebody from England, for example, who moves into the area and is basically worse than an unfree native. You can't marry anybody from this area, you can't own property in this area, you can't necessarily live in the area or work in the area, depending on who your lord is. So you have very, very few rights as an alltid. And speaking of rights, most of what we're talking about here applies to men. Women in Europe in this period had really restricted rights. And you do see a lot of things saying, well, Viking and Anglo-Saxon women had equality, and that's not the case. You had more rights, but there are still things like restrictions on legal representation. You can't represent yourself in court. There have to be more people who will vouch for you for certain types of crime and evidence, and it's not great for women anywhere in Europe, to be honest with you, compared to how it is in many places now. But we digress. Where are we at so far? Well, so far, if you are a bonded serf, if you are a serf, if you are an unfree peasant, a villein working in a village situation, times is hard. If you are a free peasant, times is still hard, but slightly less hard. You can earn money. If you're unfree, you can earn money. You can own things, you can own property. A slave cannot. You can earn money, a slave cannot in many situations. You have rights, you have freedoms, you have access to legal representation and recourse in the courts and that sort of thing. You have to attend your local manor court later in the high medieval period. Enslaved people do not have rights like that. But it is tough. For free peasants, you have a lot more freedom. You can move around. You have liberty to move to different places. If you live in a city, if you live in a town, the situation is different again and nuanced again. You're not as likely, if you live in a city, to be unfree, because it's a city. It's not a three-field system piece of farmland. You don't need bonded people to ensure you have a workforce. You need people with craft skills and the ability to do other things and different skills. You need soldiers and you need other stuff. So if you're in a city, chances are you are free. Chances are you practice a craft or a trade of some sort. You might be a blacksmith or a brewer or a cooper or an iron founder or whatever the heck you might be. So if you're living in a town or a city, times is hard, but not as hard as if you were a serf. If you are a serf and you manage to live in a city for a year and a day, 366 days, by modern counting, you are in many places considered free. So there are ways to buy your freedom. Traditionally in Wales, in early medieval Wales, according to the laws of Hywel Dda, Cyfraith Hywel, you can become free in three ways. If a church is built in your village, a new church is established in your area, terms and conditions, TBC. If you become a tonsured cleric, so basically if you become a monk, or if you become one of the 24 members of your lord's household. So if you become a member of the royal household, you are automatically free. If you are really good at falconry and your local brenin, your local king says, "Hello, I could do with a new falconer, this lad seems pretty good at it, why don't you come and join my court? Jump on a horse. What do you mean you don't know how to ride? Well, I'll have to fix that." You are automatically free. You have obligations then, you have to work for your lord, you live in his local area, his Maer Dref or whatever it may be. You have to do loads of work for him, but you have a secure job, and in exchange, your lord has a new skilled falconer, or lawyer, or scribe, or door guard for his feasting hall, or cook, or whatever it may be. Or harpists, you might be a bard, you might be a really talented poet, and you perform, and a local nobleman hears it and decides that you would make an excellent member of his lord's household, and he then suggests that you move to your local prince or king's household, and you are immediately whisked up through the social ranks. So, moving into the city, becoming a member of a household, paying for your manumission, all options. Once you're in the city, you're probably still doing agricultural work. A lot of people in medieval cities had gardens. They were a lot more green than many modern cities are. And thankfully that's now changing again because we've realised that concrete sucks. But in a medieval city, in medieval France, for example, in some cities, more than 3/4 of the people in the city were farmers as well as their trade. We have blacksmith farmers, we have jeweller farmers, silversmith farmers, glove maker farmers, and when we have records of them it says occupation such and ploughman such and gardener, and it's lovely that they were doing that because it means that cities, far from just being these grey, brown, muddy messes that we see on TV and in films, were places where there were gardens, vegetables were being grown, livestock was being reared, people were producing food, they were making flower gardens, for goodness sake. They had rose gardens in medieval Paris. People were making flowers grow just because they're beautiful, not just because some of them had health benefits, but because they loved to look at flowers. And that's really not something you think about when you think about medieval peasants, is that they were growing poppies because they're pretty. So, lots and lots of interesting subtleties going on there. One of the big things that you see on the internet is medieval peasants had more holidays than you. And yes, but medieval peasants observed more religious holy days than you. I'm pretty sure the majority of you guys watching here aren't as fastidious in your religious observance as a medieval peasant. So, not only are you going to church, you are attending holy day services, you are attending processions, you are required to do all sorts of extra observances. You have your Lenten fast, you have special days where you have to go to extra services. So you're not on holiday, these are holy days. And feasting doesn't mean you get the day off. It just means you get drunk after you've finished everything else you have to do that day. You're running a farm full time. You have to do everything on the farm and also do your extra religious stuff. Like, the fact that you live in medieval Europe that is dominated by the Roman Catholic Church doesn't mean you have better labour conditions than people in Western Europe today. That is nonsensical to suggest. However, they did have, to a certain extent, an easier time where rent control, for example, is concerned in some times and in some places. Like, there are places where domain lords, D-E-M-E-S-N-E, but with the same root as domain, like somebody who dominates, domain lords might be very lenient, and they might see their peasants as people, their flock that they have to look after. They might be very religious, they might be very charitable, you might have very low rent, you might get lots of help from your lord with social mobility. If you are a struggling villein, he might say, hey, look, this land over here is a little more fertile, it might be a little easier for you. Why don't we move you over to this land? Oh, and by the way, if you move to this land, that means you're now a free subject, so congratulations, you are no longer living in villeinship. Great stuff. And if you're wondering if villein and villain are the same word, yes, they have the same root. A twirly moustache, top hat wearing person is a baddie because a chivalrous high medieval knight looks down upon the bonded, unfree serfs that he owns. Well, he doesn't own them, but you know what I mean. And sees them as lesser, as less than, as bad. As their terrible goings-on and the things that they do, ooh, aren't they awful and seedy and villainous? So that's why villain and villain sound so familiar. Now, one of the other important things to do with these holy days is the church is a group that's often missing from these pyramids. Like, you see these pyramids, kings, barons, nobles, knights, free peasants, serfs, slaves. The church, like, the church is massive. Okay, in Europe in the medieval age, in the Holy Roman Empire, some places in the empire, the church owned more than a quarter of the land. It's one of the reasons the Reformation took hold so much in places, was people, nobles saying, hey, you know what, yes, hell yes, I'd like another 25% of the land. Yes, please, let's take it off the Pope. Let's give it to me instead. That's one of the reasons. There was so much land that the church had that they had a huge amount of control. Tens, hundreds of thousands of peasants worked unfree and free on their land. This villeinage, this serfdom, was in place on church land. And if you've ever read the Cadfael books by Ellis Peters, you'll know that this was happening. Because it's not just Brother Cadfael working in the gardens, is it? It's the other brethren, and it's the lay brothers, the lay brethren, and it's the villeins. They're all around. This is all happening in the books. It's really, really good. I suggest you recommend them. You also get the interesting Welsh aspect. Even in the first book, there's mention of the Alltid, Engelard, who is an Englishman, who is not allowed, therefore, to marry a native Welsh girl. And there is the offer of money to a local Welsh landowner, which is insulting because money means nothing to him because he's Welsh. So it's great. It's really cool. Anyway, I've digressed slightly, but the church, these monasteries, it's not just prayer, it's also growing all of this produce that is being used to feed the monks and their local peasantry, and also being sent to market if there's any excess. Taxes are always being paid, both to the king, and there are church taxes as well in certain places at certain times and in certain ways. There's a lot of subtlety. So, medieval peasants have poor diets, it's mostly grain-based. You can forage, you can feed your pigs in the local forest, but you'll probably have to pay your local demesne lord to be allowed to use his forest. You can hunt if you pay and ask if you can use the hunting ground, which will potentially be refused. If you're unfree, you have no mobility, you can't even move to the next village to get better work unless you're okay with being a cottier, and then you're effectively homeless. If you're enslaved, you know what that means. If you're a free peasant, yeah, you can move to a city. Rent is high in the cities. If you don't have a specialist trade or you're not particularly useful, you might struggle. You might be living in an attic, above an inn, on the floorboards. So, life is really tough. Yeah, you've got lots of religious holidays, but those religious holidays basically involve you taking time out of your day to go and sit in a medieval church and listen to a Latin Mass, half of which you probably don't really understand. Yeah, you could join the church, you could become a monk, but then you're not a medieval peasant, you're a member of the clergy. And that's a very subtle difference, but it is a very real, tangible difference. Like, you are a monk, you are taking a vow of poverty, but you are not a villein, you are not a bonded serf, you are not a peasant working the land. So, did medieval peasants have it easier than you? I really, really hope not. I hope that you guys watching all have easier lives than your average medieval serf, especially, but being a medieval peasant wasn't a hugely popular thing, and yet people did become villeins voluntarily so that they had tenure, so that they had that security, because tenure is very, very important, just like in academia, getting tenure. This is my land. Phew, I have land, if everything goes smoothly, forever. For me and my family to live on and work and grow food on. Phew, that is such a relief, right? That's amazing that you have, I don't have land, this is what, I got a flat, I haven't even got space to grow my own carrots, right? Because my landlord decided to turn the backyard into a car park. Yuck. So, in that way, a medieval peasant has more land than I have. And many peasants in the cities owned that little patch of land that they were growing, by the way. That was something that they had a leasehold or a freehold on. But I've got healthcare. Like, I've got all my teeth. And yeah, they're a little bit yellow because I drink too much tea, but I have healthcare. I have vitamins. I have a job that I love. that you guys pay me to do. You guys are my domain lords, so thank you very much indeed. But there are loads of other benefits to not being a medieval peasant. If any of you guys have got any interesting factoids about medieval peasants where you're from or that you've read, do put them in the comments, because I love all of the little snippets of information on this subject that keep pouring in. It's really, really interesting, the different subtleties in different areas. Like if you have any knowledge of what it was like being a medieval peasant in, for example, the Netherlands or Croatia, pop it in the comments. That would be really, really interesting to know. So, medieval peasantry was tough. It was a tough old life. And I'm pretty glad that I'm not a medieval peasant day to day, because I don't really like only having one pair of underpants, and that would be hard for me. So, do you think you'd do okay as a medieval peasant? I don't know if I would, but thank you ever so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed this little look into why it maybe isn't as cut and dry as we thought it was, and why medieval peasantry is a little bit more nuanced than we thought it was as well. So, diolch yn fawr am ymuno. Thank you very much indeed for joining. I hope that you are safe, that you are free, and that you are enjoying not having to live under medieval ecclesiastical law and a feudal system that can tie you to an acre of land. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Till the next time, tan y tro nesa. Hwyl fawr. Bye bye.